Hello, everyone. My name is Jamie Williams. I work for the MITRE Corporation, where I am a principal adversary emulation engineer. I've been at MITRE for a little over 5 years. Had really a great honor working with amazing people, especially focusing on how do we take the lessons we learn from cyber threat intelligence, those insights and those kind of understanding these adversary behaviors, and apply that to how we do offensive assessments. So really, the focus of today is going to be sharing not only what we learned and kind of how we've, lessons we've learned and how we've kind of perceived the way we currently do adversary emulation, but more importantly, thinking about what can we do better? What are some of the challenges that we're facing? But also, equipping you with some maybe insights in terms of what are we doing to maybe start. Not we're never going to solve every challenge. We're never going to make anything perfect, but ways we can start to chip away at some of those challenges to make again adversary emulation more accessible for everyone in the defender space. So quick agenda, just keeping it short and sweet. We'll do a little bit of conversation and kind of analyzing and understanding what does current adversary emulation look like. What is, and as practitioners in this space, what are we doing? But more importantly, like I said, using ourselves as kind of the punching bag and the example. How can we do adversary emulation better? And this is really exciting for us, especially coming from the MITRE perspective, where we are always looking for improvements and bettering ourselves and figuring out not necessarily criticizing, but what works, and where those opportunities where maybe what we're doing isn't necessarily optimized or ideal. So, without further ado, let's take a look at, hopefully this resonates with you and kind of your adversary emulation experience. But, what does typical adversary emulation look like? So, thinking about this talk, the first words that came to my mind was see adversary, emulate adversary. So, how often does it kind of play out where, in the spirit of adversary emulation, we see a threat, whether it's a certain threat actor, a group, a campaign, a piece of malware, pick your favorite noun here, but we see this adversary. We spend some time, doing development, testing, documentation, all this process. And eventually our output is this adversary emulation plan. And these are great because it allows us, as we said before, to really translate CTI and cyber threat intelligence into actionable offensive assessments that we can use to understand our defenses, but also improve them. But, the question starts to bubble up. Is this perfect? Is this ideal? And really, taking a step back and looking at what we've done over the last couple of years, really this pattern repeats where, we see an adversary, we spend some time building the plan, documenting, testing, and we build another plan, and it happens again and again and again. And it almost starts to look like a hamster wheel where, more or less we're kind of reactionary. We're looking at adversaries, we're kind of following their lead, but eventually, it kind of might feel like you're getting lost in that cycle of, just kind of trailing CTI, which, we're definitely fans of and has a lot of impact. But is this, again, the central premise is this optimal? Is this ideal? And, inevitably we get to this place where we start to, self-reflect. And if anyone who's been on Twitter has probably been a part of this very spirited conversation of, is this the right way we should be doing it? Especially thinking about adversary emulation versus something that's a little bit more creative and, less kind of bounded. When we think about adversary simulation, where, we're emulating more of a threat. We're using CTI as inspiration, but maybe we're taking into account, being more creative in terms of, how an adversary, a lot more creative liberties of how would an adversary actually operate in this particular environment with these conditions, with this data, with these insights. And then, even more kind of unbounded red teaming, where, we're, taking down that, stripping that kind of requirement of following CTI and really just taking a look at an environment in terms of, as an offensive engineer, what are the weaknesses here? What are the potential vulnerabilities? What are those attack vectors and attack kind of chains look like? And delivering that kind of offensive perspective from just, potentially with a certain goal in mind, what's possible. So, inevitably, we do end up in this space where, relative to adversary emulation and all these other disciplines, starting to measure, which one's best, which, for a particular environment or in general. And this was something that I was really trying to focus on avoiding, where rather let's look at the benefits of all of these. What makes adversary emulation, usable and practical and helpful, but also doing the same for simulation and red teaming, where really in the spirit of offensive assessments and offensive engineering, let's just try to borrow, the best qualities of each and really kind of land on that middle point of, in the end of the day, we are defenders. We're using our unique skills and our unique insights to better defenses and improve our abilities to detect and mitigate against adversaries. So, as an improvement and a potential way to kind of rethink and reinvigorate the way we do adversary emulation, let's maybe start to borrow those lessons learned from these different disciplines and measure that relative to these challenges that we kind of see in this practice. So again, not going to claim to have solved adversary emulation or have some foolproof perfect solution, but there's always a better way. And this is something we've been exploring over the last couple of years, and have thankfully had some opportunities to actually put pen to paper and create some of these products. So again, similar to our agenda, keeping it short and sweet. I guess my big pitch for today is let's think about how we can make adversary emulation faster, more real, and make it actually matter to defenders. And I think this is something that across all disciplines of offensive assessment we would agree with, but also these are just good qualities. But we're going to spend a couple of minutes actually unpacking this and seeing, what does it actually look like, and maybe what are some tangible lessons and some, some practices and ideas that we can kind of integrate into the way we do adversary emulation to exaggerate these points. So relative to making it fast, and I think, of the three disciplines we discussed, I think red teaming and red teams are really kind of the leader in this respect, where, not saying red teaming is easy, because it's absolutely not. It takes a huge background and corpus of knowledge and experience and wisdom. But again, when you think about a red teaming, a lot of it is that exploration of, it starts with hopping on keyboard. Let's figure out an environment. Let's, kind of start to unwrap this puzzle and figure out, where are those, from that offensive perspective, where are these weaknesses that we can start to, abuse or exploit. Whereas where we think about adversary emulation, very often we are in the case of, oh, great, like you want to emulate, this named actor, this piece of ransomware, this, particular campaign, there's that lead-in time where it's not directly accessible. It's not going to be something that we just spin up and can do tomorrow. There's a research process. There's a, development process, and not saying those things don't exist in red teaming, but red teaming is, typically something that is a little bit more, let's start with getting on keyboard. We'll figure things out and bring tools in as needed. But it's just a lot more of that cost of entry is really what we're trying to exaggerate when we think about making adversary emulation faster. So in this case, this is something that we kind of meditated on and tried to figure out, how do we make, adversary emulation something that you can just grab and deploy. And, but the biggest lesson learned here was, again, making adversary emulation something that starts with hands on keyboard. So the example we kind of have here is showing that adversary emulation can be we've seen other projects do this, but something that is tangible for not only just quick, in this case looking at emulating process injection from just double clicking on a binary, something that can be deployed rapidly, but also something that, again, can be, doesn't take the full wisdom of a red teamer, where, red teams go off, they learn lessons, they devise tradecraft and TTP execution. Let's see if we can package that up and make that as easy as possible to actually execute. So this was something that we took to heart in terms of when we're building these plans, let's make sure you don't need to be, an offensive expert or have a rich history in tradecraft and wisdom. But really, the really only prerequisite is understanding, what kind of behaviors or what kind of scenarios do I need to execute? And then being able to kind of locate that and deliver it. So moving on to our second point, making it real. And I think this is where adversary simulation really kind of has it right. One of the key premises of this threat-informed offensive assessment is, rather than just hopping on keyboard and doing, using whatever tools, you have a preference for, or, whatever kind of just felt right in the moment, actually making it prioritized and making it relevant. So, thinking about a bank versus a hospital versus a government agency, all of them are going to have different threat models. But also, one of the, I guess, the bigger critiques of adversary emulation is, if you're just truly following CTI, some of those TTPs, by nature are potentially years old. So they might not necessarily be relevant. Not saying that's always the case, because one of the things that attack and other similar knowledge bases have taught us is that adversaries reuse a lot of tradecraft because it works. And until we, as defenders, make that tradecraft not work, they're going to continue to use it. But that said, there's a lot to be said and understood about the way adversary simulation kind of marries the, learning, the threat-informed approach, learning from our adversaries and prioritizing that, but also bringing it into, the context of whatever that particular assessment is. So again, thinking about a hospital versus a school versus a government versus, a large agency versus a smaller organization, all of those are going to really change potentially how adversaries operate, but also, how we want to perform this assessment. So in this case, I always think about, one of my favorite things about working in this space is, as offensive engineers, we have the ability to tell a story. And that story really is, getting ahead and forecasting, rather than waiting for an adversary to breach this environment, let's understand and help kind of highlight and tell that story of what it would potentially look like. What would these TTPs, what would this tradecraft, what would this tool, what would this abuse, what would this exploitation, what would that look like in our environment? What can we expect in terms of defenses? But more importantly, how do we figure out what we're doing well and what we should be doing better? I think that's kind of true across all these disciplines, but really where adversary emulation and, kind of lacks and simulation potentially picks up on is telling that story in the context of the audience. So not just kind of telling this, potentially generic story where we built this plan on this particular adversary and it's up to, the offensive experts to maybe fit it into the environment. Let's kind of take that, a little bit of that freedom and saying, let's learn from those adversaries, but also make it make sense for this particular kind of environment. So in this case, our biggest lesson was not all emulation plans, should be built the same. Where, traditionally we built these huge plans that were based on a particular campaign of a particular named adversary. So as you can see, an example, a Fin 6 versus an APT29. But really where this put a little bit of that burden was, it was on the, the end user and the operator to understand, understanding that threat model of, what do I care about a Fin 6? Do I care about an APT29? That kind of knowledge is really a big cost of entry in this offensive space. But also that full kind of campaign perspective, where a lot of these plans were built to be executed end to end, initial access all the way to whatever the actions on objective are, whether it was exfiltration or encryption of data or whatever it may be. And that might be a lot. So we kind of tag this as, thinking about shirt sizes as kind of an analogy. This is a size large. For a lot of our organizations and a lot of our customers, that might be exactly where they are in terms of that maturity and that level of depth of understanding exactly what campaigns and what adversaries are on their, kind of prioritized threat model. But that's absolutely not it. So, and unpacking that a little bit, there are other sizes, thinking about, shirt sizes, 3 little bears, whatever your favorite analogy here is, we can actually also water those down into not even full campaigns, but zooming in on particular combinations of techniques. And this is something we recently explored with micro emulation plans in terms of, the full Fin 6 emulation might be great. A lot of use cases for that. But also as a defender, I could just want to focus on, process injection, an adversary, thinking about something like Cobalt Strike or typical fork and run beacon behavior of it's spawning processes, injecting into them and running commands. Same thing with a user potentially clicking on a malicious link or file, or a web shell being dropped to disk, connected to, and then running commands. All of those are going to be definitely very good candidates for adversary emulation, but also better align with maybe that kind of more, we'll think about it as a medium level of we're not necessarily looking at full end to end. We're not going to try to cover everything in attack yet, but we've at least kind of identified certain, we'll call them knuckles, or certain key technique chains that are most prevalent to us. And then even before that, it doesn't just stop at medium. We also built out these, kind of thinking about the maturity of a defender. You can't defend until you have that kind of data in front of you. So this even extends down to the lowest level of building out plans, thinking, not to belittle them, but these are some of my favorite plans of, before we even start to think about identifying malicious adversary behaviors or using this, let's look at, are we even collecting the right data in the form of, these plans were built to, simple test of, are we collecting data about file accesses? Are we collecting data about name pipes? What is our visibility into actions in the Windows registry? Just being able to think about that and saying, before we even start to think about, true positives and false negatives, are our tools even collecting this data? Is it getting to a place where we can start to build those types of logic and analytics on top of it? So again, biggest lesson on simulation was taking our adversary simulation, our kind of bigger goal of using CTI to inform assessments, and making it real, making it within the context of whatever use case our organization, our customer is, and kind of, again, not setting this high bar of you need to be here, but, meeting them where they are and kind of delivering and helping grow and tell that story of defensive improvements together. And finally, and this kind of almost goes without saying, but make it matter. And I think this is, circling back to the beginning, this is one of my favorite things that had me really sold on adversary emulation was, being able to kind of, contextualize, why does this assessment, why do these TTPs, like being able to actually tell why this matters. This is actually, in the case of adversary emulation, it kind of almost goes without saying that, a lot of what's being executed has already been seen in the wild by real adversaries. So it is kind of has that baked in prioritization. But I think in the context of marrying this with the other, key, factors that make, red teaming and adversary emulation great, really we can start to turn that on its head and saying, rather than just kind of focusing on, these TTPs coming from real CTI, we can also use the structure of adversary emulation to further highlight and exaggerate that point. Most importantly, thinking about, as you do adversary emulation, you kind of have these plans, exactly what you're going to execute. Why can't we make what we want from these, not just focusing on execution, but really focus on what we want the execution of this emulation plan to actually highlight in terms of, thinking about, for every given, technique we execute, what are our expectations? How should this be defended? Should this be defended at all? Is this a high risk TTP? Is this a lower risk? Where is the prioritization? But also, thinking about our customers. They're busy. They have things going on. A lot of things to juggle in the business world. We need to make it as clear as possible. We're executing this for this reason. Here's our expectations, and here's what we want you to do about it in terms of, clear understanding of, recommendations, strengths, weaknesses. And this is something that we kind of adopted into our most recent wave of adversary emulation plans in terms of treating them almost like attack techniques. Here's what we're executing. Here's why it matters to you. But most importantly, here are the lessons learned in terms of what you should expect from, a detection perspective or a mitigation capability. But really making sure that the so what of this simulation is really obvious. And I think that it's a little bit different than how we typically think about adversary emulation, but also it's something that makes this all round out to be a lot more clear and a lot more impactful and actionable. So we're coming on time here, but just to kind of summarize and wrap this up, I think if you got to this point, you agree with me that adversary emulation is critical, and it's something that we can use as a tool to help improve and tune security in our organizations and our networks. But again, we need to really take a step back and think about, how do we make it accessible? How do we make it fast? You don't necessarily need to be an offensive expert or some kind of SME in the red teaming to necessarily it's a problem if it's only adversary emulation is only accessible to that space. But again, how do we keep it impactful where it's real and it actually matters and we're actually able to use this facility and as a medium for making defensive changes? So I just wanted to share this link. I know I kind of referenced a lot of resources here. This is our public library of adversary emulation plans, ranging from, again, those full plans all the way down to those micro plans, all the way down to those data source focus plans. And there's a lot of really great documentation here in terms of not only resources that you can use to execute these plans, but also just understanding the philosophy of adversary emulation and how do you actually can get started and integrate it in your organization. So with that, I wanted to thank you for your time and attention and wish you the best. Thank you.